I want to talk a little bit today about graphic journalism. So, we're entering into a slightly different genre than we've been working with. We have just been in more memoir or sort of creative memoir, because, of course, in Mouse, there were these questions of how much of this has been fictionalized or not remembered correctly. And even though we have been dealing with nonfiction, this is a totally different approach because the purpose of it is to report back not your own memories in your own life, but you're on assignment, just as any other kind of journalist would. So, graphic journalism or comics journalism, although I don't like that term, covers news or nonfiction events using this framework of comics. And so these can be really stunning. So, there's really incredible, works of reportage, and they depict everything from war-torn countries, as we're looking at now, to even like wineries or cognitive science or art. It doesn't just have to be sort of war journalism. However, it seems that quite a few graphic journalistic pieces are about war torn areas. There seems to be something about that subject that is. You're able to convey something about it in a different way through this medium. And so, this is a really engaging way of reconfiguring conventional notions of how we should consume news. Because if you look at Sacco, all the traditional elements of like news reporting are there. You have interviews, you have facts, you have backstory, you have connections. It's exactly what you'd find in a long read piece of somebody who's been assigned to a field for a while. But obviously it's conveyed in this very different way, and because of this, it appeals to a different kind of reader, maybe one that we would call an untargeted audience, someone who maybe wouldn't read that long form article in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the New York Times, because that can in itself be a really limiting experience. And so it it brings in this untargeted readership, but it does keep the journalistic integrity intact. And it helps us offer a level of nuance and depth, even humanity into global issues that is a little more difficult to do with just words. And obviously, journalism has relied on photography for a long time to bring that element of pathos in. But this gives us something a little bit different. It can also help us understand information differently. So if you've ever given a PowerPoint in a class before, sometimes it's way easier to have that statistic or that graph up on your PowerPoint than it is to just kind of like try to explain data. So there's one I found a year and a half ago, that I thought I had. There we go. Forgot to link up this title. It was one that came out during the 2017 Paris climate talks, and it's talking about obviously the Earth's climate, and it was delivered to a lot of people in front of at the Paris Climate Accord. And it's interesting. It just breaks down this very, very complicated process of the way that we globally work together to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And what I like about this is you can see how they are demonstrating statistics and dates and creating graphs through these graphics, bringing in these elements of newspaper clippings, the graphics drawings. This is literally the poster or logo, having quotes. So very intertextual. Remember, intertextuality, so important for what we're doing here. Even something as simple, this is in a different journal. But Susie Cagle is a great graphic journalist, and this is a very simple graph. She's looking at water in California, Tulare County, and use this graph like with the oranges that are so synonymous with California, and that are dependent on water, but it's done in such a visually arresting way that's very inviting. Um, Same when even breaking down details about an object, putting them in these little frames surrounding that main frame is very appealing, and we have that wonderful visual connected with the words. And so this has been nothing new in newspapers. So before there was photography, pictorial representation, mainly engravings, were widely used. There just wasn't that proliferation of photography. It's like Harper's Mag, all these newspapers, some of those things we looked at the very beginning of the semester, that look kind of like editorial cartoons, but it's supposed to be this etching or this picture of a courthouse, etc. Those have been used for a while, but it really turned into like an actual storytelling. I'd say 1965 is the one that stuck out to me. So Robert Crumb, who was one of the main dudes, other than Eisner, who influenced Art Spiegelman, which you guys totally pulled out in one of your reading notes of like, oh, this looks a lot like Eisner. So Robert Crumb's the other one. And he went to Bulgaria in the middle of communism and recorded his thoughts. He was sort of on assignment through a graphic novel that is just journalism, documenting what it's like being in this communist country. And a lot of it's really funny. He is really humorous with his figures. But it offers a very fascinating take, an abstracted take into life behind the Iron Curtain. In the 70s were a really, 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 really violent time in the US, and you started to get your first taste of actual reporting that was coming through comics form. So there were only a couple issues of this. Leonard Rifus created the Corporate Crime comics, which he literally just goes through crime reports, but he dramatizes it by like showing it frame by frame in this classic style. And in the 80s, about 86, 87, the photographer came out, and there's a couple different contributors to that. And this was a really big influence on Sacco, but it's obviously because of the location, but this is a very blurry photo of it, but very interesting intertextuality there of having the actual photos that were taken by the creators, and then these almost semi-realistic looking, definitely not that abstracted versions of landscapes. A little more, what am I trying to say? A little more boxy, obviously doesn't have the same kind of movement. There's a lot of stillness in this, and so this contrasted with Sacco is very interesting because, as many of you noted, like everything's chaotic, and you're absolutely right that is intentional in this piece. But Joe Sacco really made this, made the genre what it is. He really established it in a journalistic sense. So he would go on assignments to these places because he was a journalist. He's not an artist. He just sort of, he enjoyed drawing and he enjoyed comics. So he found while he was on assignment in these spaces that he just naturally, was inclined to draw. And that ended up being very, very powerful. So you've got Palestine. He's also got Safe Area Gorajed. I cannot really speak Bosnian very well. Gorazde. It's Gorazde. And The Fixer, which is also about the Bosnian War, and then most recently Footnotes in Gaza, which was put out in 2012. And actually, I haven't read that one. I think that after the semester's over, that will be my gift to myself. I'm gonna order some stuff from a bookstore, not from Amazon. We should be supporting bookstores, even though it's a little bit more money. And he gives these really meditative explorations. So of course it is like journalism, but it's very personal. Like we see him really like exploring what it's like being in a foreign landscape, and he's unpacking his cultural baggage, and we're with him in that. He's not acting like an expert at all. He's clearly just like trying to figure stuff out. Those moments in the first two chapters where he's approaching groups trying to show them like, hey, I'm not an Israeli spy. And you see his hesitancy. So I think that captures the mood so well of just this uncertainty. And it, as I mentioned, it has these humanizing elements. What it does, though, obviously you guys have noticed that there's a big focus on faces in a way that we have not seen before. So we talked about line, and a lot of you guys were great at pulling out like, oh, look at the lines in, Marjane's face or Marjane's parents' faces. You can really see that expression. But I'm excited to see what you guys say about these faces because they are something else. But by focusing on faces so much and by removing the interviewer, there really is no interviewer. These people just speak their stories for themselves. They use their own words, and these words you could see in this photo are just sort of tumbling all over the frame. And some of you guys have noticed that the words will sometimes not even have speech bubbles. They'll just be sort of like up in the ether. And And it does a really powerful job of making us see them as people and not seeing this as just a news report. So we've read McCloud, we understand how abstracting representation of a human, of a face, will increase that identification. Obviously, we do have a very realistic looking face in that it's lined. You can see individual hairs on his eyebrows. At the same time, there's something very grotesque and caricature like about these faces, which I read a couple of your reading notes already, and it seems you guys have pulled that out. And that'll be something we explore in the next couple of weeks of what is he doing with these faces? What is he trying to get us to act towards them? What is he trying to convey about these faces and about these people in Palestine? And so as we move through, I realized I didn't have a closing for this. As we move through, look for these elements of narrative and journalism. And sometimes it's pretty stark. So that moment in the second chapter where he switched completely to just these boxes on the side, these panels on the side full of text like an actual article. So notice those shifts of maybe when you're taken out of this narrative, when you remember like, oh yeah, this is a news report, this isn't, just a story. And the way that I think we did get more sucked into something like Mouse, where there was this driving plot, and here there really is no singular plot, it's an exploration.